I am incredibly excited about finally having this meeting, which brings together for the first time three really natural partners: JVP, Hindus for Human Rights, and the Indian American Muslim Council. The latter is a 17-year-old human rights advocacy organization. Hindus for Human Rights and IAMC work closely together on human rights advocacy in India because it makes sense for Indian Muslims and Hindus of conscience to stand together shoulder to shoulder, refusing to be divided, much like JVP and its Palestinian partners. I'm going to say a few words about how I got involved with JVP because it's relevant to today's meeting. I'm sure my story is like so many JVP members here, growing up surrounded by Jewish Israeli hawks and people who just casually dismiss the lives and the long history of Palestinians. When I first found JVP, I felt for the first time that I wasn't alone as a Jew. Sure, I had lots of friends who shared my horror at Israeli crimes, but not friends who spoke out as Jews on these issues. JVP offered me not only some community, but a way of parlaying my Jewishness itself as a moral voice against the perversion of my faith. I've been married to Sunita Vishwanath, who's on your screen, one of the panelists, for 15 years now. She's a Hindu, and for even longer than me, she wandered in the desert of a faith where no one would speak out against the injustices committed in the name of the religion and the nation. As in Israel, it is all too common to hear Islamophobia being expressed and enacted ever so casually in India. And sure, some Indians will speak out against it and in favor of human rights, but none would speak out as Hindus. After I found JVP in my desert, I was confident that my wife would find her JVP for Hindus. And after months of searching, and my wife is nothing if not tenacious and thorough, there were none to be had, except way back in Indian history. So what to do but to create the change that she wanted to see? Thus, Sunita created two organizations for progressive Hindus: Sadhana, which is 10 years old and focuses on bringing a progressive soul to the very orthodox religion. For example, if you want a priest for a gay Hindu wedding, Sadhana might be your only resource for finding such a person. And secondly, the organization Hindus for Human Rights, a political advocacy organization which recently celebrated its 1-year anniversary, and who here and is in the room with us today. For me, this meeting serves two vital functions. First, the work represented here is so parallel. There are so many overlaps between the goals and spirit of JVP and Hindus for Human Rights. Both organizations at their core are about acting for justice in the name of their religions which both have been hijacked by an ethno-nationalist politics and that has been brewing since at least the 1920s. I'm sure you will hear today so many overlaps from the planned annexation of Palestine and the actual annexation of Kashmir to the nation-state law in Israel and the CAA and the NRC in India, the export of police training, surveillance, and weapon systems from Israel. These are all familiar to each of us today. All of these are attempts to disenfranchise and expropriate a native Muslim population. So the time to meet has never been more urgent than it is right now. You might get the sense, as you hear from our activists today, that India is almost like the tragedies of Palestine writ large. Whereas 3 million Palestinians suffer unbelievable injustices daily, India is gearing up right now to institute the Israeli playbook for over 200 million Muslims. Secondly, I've wanted JVP and Hindus for Human Rights to meet for such a long time because you're actually brothers and sisters who are now meeting for the first time. Today, I hope will be a little like getting a genetic test where you realize you have so much more family than you ever knew that you had. You're more than allies because you're working on what is at root the same geopolitical and religious issues with only a few different names between you. Your common root is that you're both diasporic groups who refuse to cede your religions to a nationalist and supremacist politics. HfHR is much younger and less established than JVP. They're still in those difficult early days. I know that when JVP was a fledgling group, it was hounded on all sides. Obviously the right wing, but also the left, who wondered whether an organization that was explicitly Jewish could be trusted. Though HfHR is still in its early days, I think you'll be surprised by the parallels. IAMC, the Indian American Muslim Council, is HfHR's closest advocacy partner. But it's a different kind of organization because its members are a community that is the target of Hindutva bigotry. IAMC is 17 years old and has chapters across the United States. We have two leaders from IAMC with us today. Rashid Ahmed is a co-founder, past president, and current executive director, and Ajit Sahi is the advocacy director. Ajit will be speaking today on behalf of IAMC, and Rashid can also chime in if he'd like. Ajit Sahi is the advocacy director for IAMC. He's a veteran Indian journalist whose beat was human rights and truth-telling. And what is wonderful is that he's a Hindu who is hired by a Muslim organization to lead their advocacy struggle for human rights in India. Raju is a co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights. He has a 3 decades long tenure in the corporate world, but throughout those 3 decades, particularly since 1992, the 1992 demolition of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya by Hindutva mobs, he's also devoted himself to human rights advocacy and humanitarian efforts in India. And finally, Sunita Vishwanath is my wife and a lifelong human rights activist. She's also the co-founder of 3 nonprofits: Women for Afghan Women, the largest women's rights NGO in Afghanistan, operating shelters and centers in 14 provinces. Also Sadhana, the Coalition of Progressive Hindus, and representing here today, Hindus for Human Rights. Thank you very much. I'll hand the mic over now to Ajit, yeah?
Thank you so much, Stephan, and thank you, Jewish Voice for Peace, for having me over. I have chosen today a topic to talk about the Hindu nationalism in India, the self-avowed, self-declared ideology of Hindu supremacy in India, and its historical connections with Nazism and fascism. 11 months ago, last August, the Israeli consulate in the Indian city of Mumbai organized a discussion on, it was called Leaders' Ideas of Nations in the Context of Zionism and Hindutva. The main speaker was Dr. Subramanian Swamy, an Indian parliamentarian from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's political group, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which translates as Indian People's Party. The other speaker was Dr. Gadi Taub, a professor from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a self-identified proponent of Zionism. Dr. Swamy's credentials as a Hindu nationalist are second to none. In 2011, Harvard University ousted him as visiting professor after he published an op-ed in an Indian newspaper recommending demolition of mosques and stripping Indian Muslims of voting rights. At the Israeli consulate's event last year, Dr. Swamy invoked the name of Vinayak Savarkar, modern India's earliest and most famous Hindu nationalist, who coined the term Hindutva when he published a tract in 1923 titled Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? In Washington, D.C., which is where I live, the Hindu American Foundation, which is the premier Hindu nationalist organization for advocacy purposes, is openly allied with various pro-Israel organizations, notably the American Jewish Committee, stressing that they jointly work against their common enemy, Islamic extremism, if not Islam itself. The Hindu American Foundation is, of course, but one of the many Hindu nationalist organizations active in the United States. The largest of these are the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh USA, which translates as Hindu Volunteer Corps USA, and the Vishv Hindu Parishad of America, or the World Hindu Council of America. Although purporting to be an independent American organization, the HSS, which was founded in 1989, is virtually a subsidiary of another organization, which is called Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It's quite a mouthful, but it basically translates as National Volunteer Corps. And it calls itself the world's largest Hindu nationalist organization. It was founded in India as a cult in 1925. If you go to the About Us page of the HSS USA website, it has a quote from the founder of the RSS, Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, who founded it in 1925. The Wikipedia page on HSS directly calls the HSS a subsidiary of the RSS. The RSS in India is the juggernaut that sustains Hindu nationalism, both in India and overseas, through millions of supporters and an annual budget of hundreds of millions of dollars. It has unaccountable wealth, including sprawling properties across India. And yet, it has never filed taxes because it is an unregistered organization. It was banned in 1948 because Mahatma Gandhi's assassin had been a member of the RSS, although the RSS feebly denies that. Even Savarkar, the proponent of Hindutva, was accused of masterminding the conspiracy for Gandhi's assassination, but was discharged on technical grounds of legality. Mr. Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, has spent 61 of his 69 years as a member of the RSS, having joined it at the age of 8. The two men who are today India's president and vice president, they too have been RSS members from their earlier years. Dozens of Indian ministers and hundreds of national and state legislators in India are first and foremost RSS members. They adhere less to India's pluralist constitution and more to the RSS charter to convert India into a Hindu nation with less than equal rights for India's non-Hindu minorities, the largest of whom are an estimated 200 million Muslims and 25 million Christians. The RSS portrays itself as a proud Indian nationalist organization. In truth, the RSS explicitly supported the British colonial rule and forbade its members from joining India's freedom struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi. When India gained independence in 1947, the RSS refused to accept Free India's new flag because it included green, which is the color of Islam. For decades, the Indian flag never flew atop the RSS headquarters. When Free India adopted its new constitution in 1950, the RSS rejected it because it was premised on liberal, progressive principles of equality for all and not on ancient Hindu canons of caste supremacy, misogyny, and second-class status for non-Hindus. From time to time, the BJP and the RSS describe India's pervasive anti-minority violence as acts of a fringe group, unconnected with them. That has been repeatedly proved to be a lie. In fact, a host of RSS-affiliated militant organizations are the prime perpetrators of the persecution of Christians and Muslims across India, carrying out lynchings, demolishing places of worship, including mosques and churches, and organizing violence on individuals, neighborhoods, and communities of the minorities. Over years, dozens of BJP RSS leaders, including national and state legislators, have been named for involvement in violence against minorities. Most such cases have been dropped by the prosecution since Mr. Modi became Prime Minister in 2014. Last year, Mr. Modi appointed as minister an RSS man whose militant group in 1999 had burnt to death an Australian pastor and his two sons, aged 6 and 10, as they slept in their car. For close to a century, three men have been the RSS's ideological, moral, and spiritual patron saints. Savarkar, the propounder of Hindutva, who was also accused of masterminding Gandhi's assassination; Hedgewar, the RSS founder; and Hedgewar's successor as RSS chief, a man named Madhav Golwalkar. Three names. Today, when the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh USA and its zombies hold their Sunday parades and organize conferences across the US, the portraits of these three gentlemen are prominently displayed and the stream of congregants bow before them. It is no small irony that modern-day Zionists should consort with the RSS, given that Savarkar, Hedgewar, and Golwalkar were the ultimate fanboys of Adolf Hitler, his Nazi ideology, and the persecution of Jews. In 1940, Savarkar said, quote, "There is no reason to suppose that Hitler must be a human monster because he passes off as a Nazi. Nazism proved undeniably the savior of Germany under the set of circumstances Germany was placed in," quotes closed. When Gandhi's political heir, Jawaharlal Nehru, who would later become India's first prime minister, criticized Hitler and Mussolini, Savarkar rhetorically asked, quote, "Surely Hitler knows better than Nehru what suits Germany best," quotes closed. Savarkar said that Germany or Italy had, quote, so wonderfully recovered and grown so powerful as never before at the touch of Nazi or fascist magical wand is enough to prove that those political isms were the most congenial tonics their health demanded. Quotes closed. Savarkar blamed Jews for failing to assimilate in the German society. Elucidating his definition of nationalism, he said, quote, "A nation is formed by the majority living therein. What did the Jews do in Germany? They, being in a minority, were driven out from Germany," quotes closed. Golwalkar, the successor, the second chief of the RSS, went further and called Hitler's treatment of the Jews, within quotes, race pride. He said, quote, "Race, with culture and language, with which culture and language are inseparably connected, constituted a nation." He added, quote, "To keep up the purity of the race and its culture, Germany shocked the world by her purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Race pride at its highest has been manifested here. Germany has also shown how well nigh impossible it is for races and cultures having differences going to the root to be assimilated into one united whole, a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by." Let me come to the conclusion of my piece. In 1931, Hedgewar, the guy who founded the RSS, his mentor, a doctor, an Indian doctor named V.S. Munje, traveled to Italy and met Mussolini. This was in 1931. Prior to that meeting, Dr. Munje had visited Italy's military college, the Central Military School of Physical Education, the Fascist Academy of Physical Education, and the Balila and Avant-Gardist organizations, which were, as we know, the fascist youth organizations that recruited boys from the age of 6 and gave them paramilitary training. When the dictator asked Dr. Munje what he thought of them, Dr. Munje replied, quote, "Your Excellency, I am much impressed. Every aspiring and growing nation needs such organizations," quote close. Actually, allow me to quote a little more from Munje's diary, because he kept a diary, and he wrote, "Italians by nature appear ease-loving and non-martial like Indians. They have cultivated, like Indians, the work of peace and neglected the cultivation of the art of war. Mussolini saw the essential weakness of his country. The idea of fascism vividly brings out the conception of unity amongst people. Hindu India needs some such institution for the military regeneration of the Hindus. Our institution of the RSS is of this kind. I will spend the rest of my life in developing and extending this institution." And he further wrote, quote, "Leaders should imitate the youth movements of Germany and the Balila and fascist organizations of Italy. I think they are eminently suited for introduction in India, adapting them to suit the special conditions," quote close. After his return to India, Dr. Munje immediately met Hedgewar, the founder of RSS, and they decided to set up a military school to train Hindu youth. And that military school has now completed 90 years, and some of its products have been accused of being involved in terrorism against Muslims in India. Munje also wrote that the Hindu nationalist ideal cannot be implemented until a Hindu dictator took power, like, quote, Mussolini or Hitler of the present day Italy or Germany. I would like to conclude my remarks here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I will be happy to take questions later.
I think we have to go to Raju next.
Yeah, can I begin? Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to share my thoughts with you. And I thank Leila and Stephan for their introductions, and Ajit for an excellent capsule of the history of what has brought India to this day. And what I want to focus on a little bit is about my own personal journey, and to talk a little bit about what is happening now in more specific terms, in terms of Hindutva Zionist collaborations and what is happening to what many of us consider our beloved India, the way it's heading. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint, so please bear with me. Ajit has touched on many of the points. And as far as points dealing with Israel is concerned, I think I'm dealing with a very informed audience. So I'm going to skip through and not elaborate on some of those points because the bullets speak for themselves, but I will emphasize only those points that need further elaboration. Thank you so much. Let me go to the PowerPoint. pardon me. Yeah, I labeled this as a Hindutva Zionism intersections, which historically Ajit has already talked about, and talk about some of the seismic shift in India-Israel relationship under Prime Minister Modi. Let me start with a little bit of my personal journey. What is a Hindu doing talking to Jewish Voices for Peace? In student years, almost many of my friends, all of us were great admirers of Israel. And this is still the continuing trend among the younger folks. When I came to the US, the person who met me at the airport and mentored me, and he was my boss, was a Russian Jew from whom I learned a lot about what had happened in the Jewish diaspora.
Hey, Raju, sorry to interrupt, but we're not seeing your PowerPoint.
Oh, you're not? Okay. Oh, what's going on? My apologies.
There we go.
My apologies. Sorry about that. Let me start. There you go. Can you see me?
Yes, looks great.
Yeah. I started talking about my own personal journey. As students in the 60s, we were all great admirer of Israel, especially what had happened in the Six-Day War. When I came to the US, I was mentored, and my first boss was a Russian Jew who gave me a lesson on what had happened to the Jews in the diaspora. And then I got exposed to the Palestinian Nakba from a National Geographic article, which talked about the large-scale mass transfers of populations. And when I moved to the West Coast, I got exposed to what was happening in UC Berkeley, especially in the Middle Eastern Studies department, where there's a lot of resistance to even talk about Palestinians. And I participated in pro-Palestine marches in San Francisco. And I also had Palestinian colleagues at my workplace who gave me the other side of the story. Then I got involved in a Palo Alto peace group that was organizing a model peace with actual Palestinians and Israelis coming together to talk about a model peace, including, I think, Hannah Signora and a few other people. Finally, in 1998, I did what I had wanted to do for a long time, visit Palestine and Israel with Middle East Children's Alliance and a professor from Stanford. And we met a whole host of people during that, both Israelis and Palestinian groups. And I even remember meeting the second in command of Hamas during that trip. And I was just Googling and found that he was assassinated by Israel in 2003. I think Ishmael Abu Shanav is the name I remember. I also was intrigued by A.B. Nathan's approach using Gandhian techniques and hunger strikes and so forth. And he was one of the earliest people to make contact, despite being banned from doing so with Palestinian groups. And later on with Arun Gandhi, who made some comments about Israel's culture of violence. Arun Gandhi is one of the grandsons of Gandhi. So this has been the kind of sum total of my exposure to why I got involved on Palestinian issues at a time when India was still chugging along with its democracy. We talk a little bit about the Hindutva Zionist intersections. I've been exposed to both sides. One of the things that I've noticed is this really fanatic passion to rewrite history. My exposure to it was when Hindutva groups worked with Zionist groups in the California textbooks, using the California curriculum, which says you shouldn't say anything that affects the pride of the children. So in the Hindutva books, talking about the caste system, talking about what was going on with RSS were all going to affect the pride of their children, therefore they ought not to be mentioned in the textbooks. And they were working very closely with Zionist groups in how to approach that. Clearly, of course, demonizing Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs is something, as Ajit mentioned, is very common to both the groups. but also a special focus. And I think one thing that the Hindutva groups have learned very well from Zionists is how effective the name calling is. People like us were called pseudo-secularists. Then we became self-hating Hindus. Now we are all obsessed with Hindu phobia. So I'm sure you can figure out all the parallels that Jewish activists have been exposed to along similar lines. Of course, the facade of national security. Again, I don't need to elaborate how national security has always been techniques used by Zionists in terms of land acquisition and so forth. And today, national security has become the huge call in terms of what is happening in Kashmir and shutting down the internet. All of those are being done in the name of quote unquote national security. Another thing that I learned with Hindutva is despite their really, really checkered history where they have no right to call themselves Indian patriots, Hindutva groups, and especially Modi is now identifying himself with the country. Modi is India, India is Modi, and you see that in every part of their public relations campaigns. I think the title of this talk is ethnic democracy, right? Majoritarianism with a democratic face. That is what I think India has accomplished, like Israel, where people of India put Modi in power, and they have used step by step every possible democratic tool at their disposal. And today, they are in full control in doing whatever they want to do to convert the nation to a Hindu Rashtra. One of the other things that I also found interesting as I followed Hindutva is this whole issue of demographic threat. The people of Israel and all of you are quite familiar with how that has been a major issue in terms of forming a Jewish nation. What percentage of the Jewish nation can afford to be non-Jewish and still maintain the Jewish character? On the face of it, that doesn't seem to apply to India at all, which has been a majority Hindu state forever. Yet, that is still being used as a tool. And I just want to demonstrate a little bit about what they have been using in their public relations campaign. Can you all see this graph? This graph is about growth trends of Indian and other religionists in India. The upper curve, that's a downtrend, are so-called Indian religionists, which are Hindus and Jains and Sikhs. And the bottom curve is other religionists, which are basically Muslims and Christians. And this graph purports to show that by 2050, Hindus will be a minority. Not only are their statistical methodologies have been questioned, they did something very egregious when they called it the Indian religionists, other religionists in India. They conveniently included Pakistan and Bangladesh and others to show that Hindus would be a minority. But when a graph like this reaches my uncle or aunt, they're not going to bother to look at all the details. And they still mouth this issue that if we don't do something, Hindus will be a minority. In contrast, a more thoroughly researched project by Pew's Research shows that even by 2050, Hindus will still be 78% of the country. I just wanted to use this one example of the kind of propaganda that may resonate with you, given that Israel has also been very consumed by demographics. Now, some of the recent Hindutva Zionist collaborations, some of which Ajit has mentioned, increasing RSS Zionist conversation, and he used an example of the Bombay meeting with Swami and Professor Taub. And I think I sent all of you a link to one of the articles about that, which elaborates on what Ajit mentioned. And more of these things are going on every day. Clearly, Israel is a major partner for India for intelligence gathering operations. When you look at what had happened and the precise steps that India took in terms of shutting down Kashmir in August, one can clearly see a lot of similarities between what happened after the Intifada and the advice of Kissinger to the Israeli government on how to shut down various means of communication and how to shut down journalists to make occupation invisible to the rest of the world. And I think Indian government has really perfected on that lessons from Kissinger days in what they have done in Kashmir. Even today, we really don't know what is happening in Kashmir. They claim that they opened up internet, but all they can do is send simple emails, and only 2G is open, and they cannot share images or videos. So we really don't know what is going on. No journalists have been allowed. No human rights organizations are allowed in Kashmir. The result of also the new government, Modi government coming to power, is Indian government has always been a strong supporter of Palestinian rights in international organizations like United Nations, despite the fact that a majority of the younger Indians always supported Israel. The Indian government has always tread the path of supporting Palestinians. That has quickly fallen apart after the Modi government took over. Use of technology. As many of you may know, WhatsApp has become a major tool of communication, a major tool of the Hindutva folks in India, who are using it every day for disseminating their propaganda. And Modi is literally in people's living room through WhatsApp every day. And when WhatsApp was used and was used by the government to monitor opponents, monitor dissenters, one of the news reports that came out is India was using a WhatsApp monitoring application prepared by Israel and in collaboration with Israel. One small example of technology cooperation. And Ajit mentioned the emergence of the Hindu American Foundation in advocacy in Washington, which I suppose fashions itself after APAC. What we are trying to do, or hoping to do with our collaboration, is to provide an alternative voice to advocacy in the US Congress through Hindus for Human Rights and Indian American Muslim Council. We have a long, long way to go on that. And also, Ajit mentioned arms imports, the increasing reliance on Israel as an arms supplier to India. I just wanted to share a couple of graphics to give you an idea of what's happening there. If you see this graph, this is the value of arms exported from Israel to India. And you see the sudden spike after 2014. 2014 is when Modi came to power. And you can see the history and what happened as soon as Modi came to power, the huge spike in arms export from Israel to India. If you want to compare it to the rest of the countries that India has traditionally relied on, the red pie is the United States, which used to be very small under the previous Congress governments. And Russia was always the largest exporter to India of arms. And suddenly, since Modi came, and a little bit before that, the US exports have expanded to 10%. And at the same time, Israeli exports to India have also expanded from 6.5 to 8.4. The result is Modi is trying to cut back on reliance on European powers and Russia, and more reliance on Israel and the US together. Now today, and this is why we are all here today, is our extraordinary concerns about where India is heading. Many people are simply giving up in terms of what is happening in all aspects of India, and Hindu nationals literally seem to be on the roll. And I just wanted to mention a few things. Literally since 2014 and even before, every cultural, education, even arts, human rights institutions have been taken over by the RSS or VHP. I cannot think of any exception to any of the national institutions that have not been taken over by them. And we see the impact of that everywhere, from censorship to stopping discussions, to stopping even academic discourses, taking over the Indian Historical Association, talking about the Hindutva version of history and so forth. Chipping away at the secular constitution. And this is really the ultimate agenda, which we think is going to be pursued very vigorously towards creating Hindu national state. Ajit mentioned the citizenship laws, and I just want to briefly mention what it is. It is an idea that Hindus have more right to be citizens in the context of looking at every person to be registered under the National Register of Citizens. If there are undocumented people that are Hindus and other Indo-Indian religionists who do not meet the requirements of the National Register of Citizens, they will have a path to citizenship, but Muslims will not. This is a direct threat to 200 million Muslims who can be excluded if NRC was to be pursued. And Ajit has also mentioned that we have made it routine to accept mob lynchings in relation to beef eating, beatings of people, especially Muslims who are protesting the discriminatory citizenship laws, property destruction, etc. Even while the police look on and even participate in many of these, and there is a plethora of video evidence to show all of this happening. And the most disturbing people to people like us who were always thinking of the Indian Supreme Court and judiciary as a last place of resort to protect Indian Constitution, people are losing hope even in the Supreme Court, which recently passed a long-awaited judgment in the Ayodhya Babri Masjid, practically saying it was illegal to destroy an ancient mosque, but it's okay to hand it over to Hindutva nationalists to build a temple. Curbing press freedoms are becoming very, very frequent, intimidation as well as blackmail to withholding government ads, and many media, mainstream media are already suffering and seeing a impact of this, while the digital media are struggling to stay afloat. Resort to colonial era sedition laws to arrest hundreds of activists, that is still going on, reminding you of the same people who criticized colonialists for their resort in terms of arresting Indian nationalists before independence, or resorting to the very same laws now to hound their own people. Mass arrests of protesters under a law now, which was recently amended to label even an individual activist as a terrorist, and people are already being arrested on that. And most importantly is harassment, continuing harassment of opponents through the BJP IT cell, which is renowned for its daily attack on activists and others going on. So these are some of the things I wanted to touch on. I wanted to end with a timeline, which is kind of personal in terms of my involvement. Of course, you're all familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian timeline. So I won't get into that other than the fact that we are now looking at the formal annexation of the West Bank. I also used to be looking at South Africa and apartheid as a parallel to what is happening in Israel. But as you all know, there was a time actually where I used to think that the apartheid was so entrenched that we can never overcome apartheid. But sure enough, surely Israelis will see the light of the day and allow Palestinians to live a dignified life. Lo and behold, that hasn't happened. And as you know, South Africa has long since eliminated apartheid and is a democracy, imperfect though it may be. Now, where does India stand? During those days in the 70s up to 1990, most of us thought, well, Indian democracy is also not perfect, but it's working. But 1992 changed all of that with the Advani, who was the early RSS man who did a Rath Yatra, followed by the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and Gujarat pogroms in 2002, where over 2,000 Muslims were killed, and the SC ruling in Ayodhya in 2019, and so forth. And today, we are looking at next week, India is going to be, and of course, Kashmir has already been fully carved down, but next week, Modi is going to inaugurate the grand Ram temple, which has now been legitimized by the Supreme Court, which really in some ways is the end of a chapter for some of the people in RSS, is the beginning of a very dire chapter for the rest of India. So let me stop there. Thank you all. And I will just refer you to further reading. There are 2 articles that I will just, there you go. Thank you. Sunita?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, great. So thank you. Thank you to my teammates, my life teammates, Stephan, and my teammates, Raju and Ajit. I'm so happy to be working with all of you. And honestly, it's been months that we've been saying, let's do this webinar for the JVP community. And I can't believe this is it, we're doing it. And I'm really grateful to everybody who's here tonight. Like Raju, I'm a co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights. We are Hindus of conscience who will stand up against human rights violations anywhere on earth, but feel a particular responsibility to speak out against the perversion of the faith that we were both born into. And that perversion you've been hearing about, it's Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. I have pursued a life in human rights activism and advocacy, and at any point, if anybody had asked me what was my motivation to seek justice in the world, I would have told them it was the Hinduism I was raised with. Simple but powerful teachings that led me to my life's work. As a child, I remember asking my elders, if God is in all of us, then why do we practice untouchability? And if we are all one, then am I not one with a Muslim as well? The oldest Hindu scripture, the Rig Veda, which is believed to be 3,000 to 4,000 years old, tells us, the truth is one, but sages call it by different names. And let noble truths come from all directions. And the world is one family. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the core of my Hinduism is open, is questioning, curious, inclusive, expansive. And Hindutva is a political ideology, which is exactly the opposite. Hindutva, as we have learned, dates back to the 1920s. It is deeply and directly influenced by Nazism. Hindutva's goal is to make India into a Hindu nation, what we call a Hindu Rashtra. And in the words of the current chief of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, Hindu Rashtra is non-negotiable. The word Hindutva just means Hindu-ness. And because of that, many Hindus embrace and propagate its hateful tenets, believing that they are just propagating Hindu beliefs. But actually, the central tenets of Hindutva and Hinduism are diametrically opposed. Hindutva is exclusive and Islamophobic. Hindutva is violent and paramilitaristic, whereas Hinduism embraces ahimsa, which is non-violence and non-harm. Hindutva is hyper-masculine, whereas Hinduism teaches us that there is no goddess without God and there is no God without goddess. We need this balance of male and female energy, and all matter contains both female and male energies. Several things in my life led me to this work that I'm doing in the Hindu community. As I grew up, as I grew older, I was more and more disturbed by the rightward shift in my own Hindu spaces, in my extended family, in my parents' friends' circles, and in temple communities. What was very upsetting was that caste superiority and Islamophobia were more and more overtly and explicitly expressed. And again, as we heard, in India and in the Indian diaspora, Hindutva ideology was becoming more and more mainstream. In 1992, the Babri Masjid was demolished by Hindutva mobs. This was my first awakening to the fact that Hindus could be a violent mob. Then 10 years later, we saw the carnage in Gujarat under the watch of our current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who was then the Chief Minister of Gujarat, when Hindu mob riots led to the death of more than 2,000 people, mostly Muslim. And I noticed that any time Hindus, people who identified as Hindu, were quoted in the newspapers, they always represented Hindutva ideology, and there were never Hindus quoted who challenged these views. And then finally, my work in Women for Afghan Women brought me shoulder to shoulder with Muslim men and women who literally risk their lives daily for the safety and rights of women and girls. And to the last one, if you ask them why, they said, They did this work because it was their religious obligation. And these brave activists led me to ask, where are the Hindus who will risk their lives to defend Hinduism against Hindutva? Where are the Hindus who are horrified by the Gujarat carnage? Where are the Hindus who insist on love and not hate? And since I simply could not find the Hindu counterparts to my Afghan co-workers and other faith-based justice seekers, I decided about a decade ago that I myself need to speak up as a Hindu that's centered in love. So following and journeying with JVP has given me immense hope and inspiration. Just as JVP includes both religious and secular Jews in their leadership and membership, Hindus for Human Rights also includes religious and secular Hindus in our movement. Just as JVP mobilizes a diverse and robust Jewish opposition to Zionism and the occupation of Palestine, Hindus for Human Rights is building a small but definitely growing Hindu opposition to Hindutva. And most Jewish organizations prioritize the rights of Jews. Most Hindu organizations prioritize the rights of Hindus. But JVP and HfHR, we are different in that we draw on our respective faiths to advocate for the rights of all people. And we oppose bigotry of all oppressors, including people of our own faith communities. So it's been a decade since Sadhana was founded and 1 year since Hindus for Human Rights was founded, and the path has been rough, to say the least. The Hindu right naturally despises us, trolls us. There's been some trolling messages greeting us tonight as well. They dismiss us as anti-Hindu and anti-national, and this is not a surprise. The Hindu mainstream, our family members, people we might meet randomly in the community, people who, are just living their lives and probably are not at all bigoted, but who have swallowed the Hindutva narrative completely because it's everywhere. It's everywhere we look in the media. And they also see us as divisive and anti-Hindu, but in this mainstream space, we are often able to engage in some amount of thoughtful dialogue, and we have some hope for these dialogues. And finally, the Indian left, because the only anti-Hindutva public voice pretty much since Indian independence has been a secular one, and because Hindus who do not support Hindutva have either been silent or they have decided not to identify as Hindu. I know this happens also in the Jewish community. The left has come to equate Hinduism with Hindutva. The notion of a progressive Hinduism feels anachronistic to many, and I have been told directly to my face more than once that what I'm trying to do to build a progressive and inclusive and anti-caste Hinduism is simply impossible. And while we understand this level of exclusion, suspicion from the left, it certainly has been the most painful part of the journey for us, for me. So in spite of all of this, for two main reasons, we persist in this endeavor. One, our faith. We are sincere in our desire for this Hinduism that we dream of, which rejects caste and does not discriminate among people. And we know that our religion, just like all religions, has flaws and has urgent need for reform. However, we are not willing to cede this religion of ours within which we were born and raised to those who hate and kill. There is enough good and love and truth in our faith that we will do all we can to defend it from the forces of destruction. And the second reason is just sheer logic. If we are to annihilate caste and defeat Hindutva and put India back on the course of democracy and human rights of all citizens, this is simply not possible without Hindus, who are the majority of the population, and the population that is in power. Who will annihilate caste if not Hindus? And who will reject and defeat Hindutva if not Hindus? To those on the left who are working towards the same goal, but will not work with Hindus, I ask, How will you achieve your goals without Hindus? Do you expect the world's billion Hindus to all just leave the Hindu fold? Is this a reasonable or rational wish or aspiration or expectation? And does the world you are envisioning and building, does it include everyone? Does it include all of us? In conclusion, things in India are getting worse. The space between Hinduism and Hindutva is shrinking, it is disappearing. And many argue that India is already a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu nation. And perhaps precisely because of how bad things are, the spaces and coalitions of resistance are slowly but surely expanding and making room for us. We find more and more that Hindus for human rights can work with Dalit groups and Muslim groups and other minority groups. And this is fantastic for us. And it's sad that this is happening in the face of the situation getting worse. Strategically, speaking out on a polarizing issue like Palestine may not earn us solidarity among Hindus, but since our heart's desire is for justice across the world, we are with the people of Palestine 100%, and we will not shy away from saying so. And our beloved JVP family, we are honored to travel with you, mobilizing people from within both our faith communities to stand together in solidarity with all the people of the world fighting for basic resources to be able to live, just live, fighting against authoritarian regimes, fighting for dignity and human rights. As Stephan and I wrote recently in a JVP newsletter, our relationship, and we meant our relationship, but in this context, I think this applies also to our relationship with all of you, the relationships between our organizations and movements. Our relationship has been deepened by our shared activism against Jewish and Hindu extremism while responding from within our faiths. We reject the walls erected by identitarian thinking and assert that hope for humanity lies in connections across difference. Hindus often quote Atithi Devo Bhava from the Upanishads, which means be one for whom stranger is God. And this is so close to the principle in Judaism of welcoming the stranger. So let us all unite and insist on welcoming the stranger. Thank you so much. And I think we have to switch now to our Q&A session. And Leila is going to help me if I need help. There's questions in the Q&A box, and
Sunita, I added 4 in the chat.
Okay.
Be great to start with.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leila. So here are 4 questions, and the questions are for all panelists, and Ajit, Raju, also Leila and Sam, if you would like, and Stephan also chime in. So the first question is, it seems like everything Hindutva related stems from the RSS organization itself. However, confronting it is difficult because of how deep and grassroots based it looks to be. How can we organize against it and its associated groups? Ajit, Raju, do one of you want to jump in?
Sure, this is Ajit. I can handle that. So the important thing to understand is that the roots of, just as the roots of Hindu nationalism are very deep in India, and they're very prominent. They are now the majority in Indian Parliament. They have rendered almost all democratic institutions moot, such as including the judiciary of India. The democratic traditions are also very, very deep in India. The Indian freedom struggle happened just 73 years ago. Next month, it will be 73 years since India's freedom from British colonial rule. And the grassroots is extremely strong. We saw that few expected the kind of response that came from, especially the Muslim community in India, after after the citizenship law was changed, modified by the Modi government in December. And we had hundreds of thousands of people across India. There was an eruption of civil society protest across India in response to the law, which has been widely covered internationally. I think the very important thing for us to do, especially in the United States, is to amplify the voice of the resistance in India. We need to, this is the only thing, a lot of people, I represent the Indian American Muslim Council, a lot of people with our organization, they constantly have this question: how can we influence the government to act, the United States government to act in the direction of holding the Indian government to account for its stated ideals of democracy, fairness, justice, honesty, equality before law? And the only answer that I have is that the only way we can do it is by creating a mass movement inside the United States, bringing attention to these violations in India. I have been a Palestinian solidarity activist myself for many years. I have even had the good fortune I've been lucky to travel to Gaza back in 2011 as part of a relief caravan. And one of the very striking things that we know today is that even though the Palestinians have not gained an inch of their land in Palestine over the decades, the fact is that now more than ever before, the Zionist ideology has gone missing from the entire liberal progressive space across the world. You could not have imagined that 20 years ago or 30 years ago. There were liberal progressive spaces that were still propagating and speaking out in support of the Zionist ideology. That's not happening anymore. The good thing is that India has suffered for the last 1 year. On 5th of August, it will be 1 year since the revocation of the special status of the state of Jammu and Kashmir in India by Mr. Modi's government. And then it was quickly followed by the most horrendous ruling by the Indian Supreme Court, awarding the rights to basically what should have been a mosque. A mosque should have been built there. That was the appropriate, that would have been the appropriate legal finding, but they instead allowed a Hindu temple to come up there. And then was followed by the citizenship law. And yet, because of these steps, Mr. Modi and his Hindu brand of Hindu nationalism has found a lot of negative coverage in the Western news media, especially in the United States. We need to amplify that. We need to come together, organize, and we need to expand that. We need to increase that awareness. We need to go to the civil society, to campuses, to academia, student bodies, to news media, to the US Congress, to the US government, to state, at the level of states. The 6 city councils have passed resolutions against India's citizenship law. The last one being San Francisco as recently as last week, Tuesday, they did that a week ago. We need to expand those kinds of activities across the United States. I think the next 2 to 3 years, that's what we need to do, is to bring even greater attention, expose Hindu nationalism. Right now, Hindu nationalism, the Indians India is seen as a great country by most Americans. Gallup, which is a polling agency, does an annual poll and of the favorability. My most favorite country does a poll of Americans, and India is the 6th most favorite country for average Americans after UK, Canada, South Korea, Japan, etc. And even Israel and Mexico are lower than India in terms of favorability. We need to work on that. That's what we need to do. And of course, protest against all kinds of the way the US government gives it a free pass, gives Hindu nationalism a free pass, gives Mr. Modi a free pass. We need to increase our protests, our rejection of that governmental.
Thanks, Ajit. And just in response, as well as doing the kind of advocacy that Ajit is talking about, and this actually covers the next question as well, which is about Kashmir. All of our groups, Indian American Muslim Council, Hindus for Human Rights, and a number of other Indian American organizations are in coalitions together doing the kind of advocacy that Ajit is talking about, and really prioritizing raising awareness in the international community. And part of that advocacy is definitely focused on Kashmir, as one person has asked about. So we are in touch with the organizations that you that you think that we should be in touch with. We are part of these coalitions. And the other thing is, again, to complement what Ajit was saying, the questioner asked about the grassroots nature of the RSS, and it has been since before independence, while those who are progressive and social justice minded in India and in the diaspora have been building secular coalitions. What has been happening, and we've been sleeping at the wheel, is that the Hindu right has been organizing deep grassroots presence across the entire country. And so, yes, and in the diaspora. And so our work is really a tall order, but this is what we are doing, trying our best to have difficult conversations on all of these issues in that mainstream space that I had mentioned when I was talking, our families, our temple communities, having those difficult conversations, which all of you understand in the Jewish community. You're doing the same thing, I know. Let me pull together 2 or 3 questions and see if we can get Raju.
Is everybody able to see the questions?
No, only we can see the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
So the questions are, the next couple of questions I'll ask. So one is, it's a very good question about the fact that there's misinformation and propaganda that is really, it's almost an industry that is creating heaps and heaps of misinformation and propaganda, and how we can work to really correct the misinformation that people are being subjected to. That's one question. And the other question is about how dangerous the collaboration between Hindutva and Zionism is, and what we can do to counter this trend. And Ajit everybody has spoken to this, but if there are any concrete ideas to how we can bring together our coalition to address the combine of Hindutva and Zionism. And if I could ask the answers to be brief.
This is Raju. I want to address this issue of misinformation and fake information and so forth. Yes, it is a huge challenge, especially in India, where one telecom company is practically controlling the entire electronic space. And in fact, they're handing out cell phones which have embedded in it the Modi application. So WhatsApp is the battleground, not the internet, not something else. So we are looking with other organizations who are working in India to counter this. It is just beginning. There are organizations that are looking at videos and determining if they're fake videos and so forth. But we have a long, long way to go. The idea of how we can interject positive messages using WhatsApp itself as a media is something that we are looking at. But the other, and when I say we, I'm talking about several partner organizations in India are working on this. But one thing I wanted to add on is, though, what Ajit said about amplifying the voices in India, I think we cannot underemphasize the role of what is said and done in the US. This is one thing that the Indian government and the Modi government seems to care for. A few years ago, when Modi was denied a visa, he could ignore everything else going on in India, but he was really, really focused on that one issue, that he was being denied a visa. So let us not underestimate the power of Hindus for Human Rights, IAMC, and JVC together, voicing whatever we can in the US, because Modi pays attention to what we say. And that should be one of the things that we exploit. Thanks.
Can I just bring up one additional point to this? It's also important to know that Modi, Hindu nationalism, has started interfering in American elections. That is something that people must understand. Last year, Canadian intelligence agencies held a confidential briefing for lawmakers of the Canadian Parliament, and they shared at where they shared information, intelligence, that Indian intelligence agencies were funding opposition parties and funding candidates who were Hindu nationalists or who were supporters of Hindu nationalism. A similar thing happened in Britain at last year's elections in England. Right now, for example, the Republican Party opponent of in Ilhan Omar's race is being, a lot of money is coming to them from Hindu nationalists in America. Similarly, with a whole lot of people who have been speaking out against Hindutva, against Kashmir in US Congress, they are facing, many of them are seeing Hindu nationalist money coming into that election. So this is something really, really important. This is the kind of tactics that the Zionist groups have long employed in America. And that is what needs to be challenged. So it's absolutely critical that at this point in time, and I think there can be no better partners than Jewish Voice for Peace, Hindus for Human Rights, and Indian American Muslim Council. Because, also, as you might know, in the last 10, 15 years, India has bought more than, I think, $12 billion worth of Israeli defense equipment. And it is now the largest buyer of Israeli defense equipment, Israeli arms, So the relationship between Israeli Zionist ideology and Hindutva ideology and the Israeli state and the Indian state is far greater, far closer than we can imagine. And it's working in only one direction, which is to strengthen Zionism in Israel and strengthen Hindu nationalism.
We have a time check. We only have, sadly, only 5 minutes left. And there are many questions. So I'm going to request Leila and Sam to actually send us these questions so that we can, it's not fair not to answer them. But I want, in closing, I wanted to ask Raju and Ajit if they have, and Stephan too, if you have any very quick closing points. Ajit especially, I know you wanted to speak to the question of, in the American context, what should we concretely be doing together, us, Hindus for Human Rights, Indian American Muslim Council, and JVP?
I think we should set up an organization, a sort of a 501c3 or a 501c4, focusing exclusively on the Hindu nationalist network infrastructure in the United States, calling it out, exposing it, because there's a huge money chain happening here. There's a lot of below the radar activity that they do. Raju earlier spoke of the California textbook crisis. There's one small thing, Sunita, that I wanted to talk about, because there are 2-3 people who have talked about Kashmir here. One participant attendee has asked, why don't we have a Kashmir voice on this panel? We thought we will speak mostly on Hindutva first, because this would be our first conversation. But I hope that going forward, IAMC, JVP, and Hindus for Human Rights will also bring to you the Kashmir issues. If you want to engage with the advocacy on Kashmir, and that's how civil society works here, we are the lead on Kashmir issues here in Washington, D.C., I can tell you, is taken by 2 organizations. One is called Stand With Kashmir, and the other is called Americans for Kashmir. You might want to check out their websites. They are our partners. We support them, and they are the leaders on Kashmir issue. But of course, as a collective, we work together.
Raju, would you like to have a closing statement?
I want to thank all the panelists, the organizers, JVP, for giving us an opportunity to share our views. I also want to thank, at one time, I think more than 175 people who tuned in to listen to us. And we want to look upon this as a beginning of the conversation, and continue it with more specific actions as we move forward, some of which Ajit has already laid out. And thanks again, and Leila, Samantha, all those who.
And I'd also like to say in closing, echoing the thanks and echoing the concrete steps that have been suggested, and also very much hoping that this is just a beginning conversation to be deepened, and we will definitely collaborate going forward. And I want to tell everybody that in the chat, I have put a couple of links. I've put the links of our organization websites, which you can explore. We hope that you will, from our website, join our mailing lists. You can follow all of us on social media, Indian American Muslim Council and Hindus for Human Rights. And we have many events and webinars pretty regularly, so stay tuned and join us in those conversations. And our Hindus for Human Rights website has past webinars interest our past webinar. Near future, and this is because this event, a consortium will be putting together a kind of a conference. And the reason for this is that most Indians assume that the diaspora community are pretty much lock, stock, and barrel with the Modi government and with Hindutva. And so our diverse coalition of progressive organizations in the diaspora will be coming together to announce that there is a strong diaspora resistance to Modi and Hindutva, and we are that voice. So please stay tuned for that announcement. And finally, in the chat, there are 2 links I just posted. And these are solidarity statements that I invite all of you to sign. One is with the Dalit community, and this statement is created by the Ambedkar King Study Circle, and it's related to the current case you might have read about in the newspapers on caste discrimination at Cisco in the Silicon Valley. And the second solidarity statement is with the human rights activist and poet, Vara Vara Rao, who is 80 years old, deteriorating in health and in a crowded prison with his family begging for his release. He is in prison simply for expressing his views. And so please sign the statement that supports his family in asking for his release. And with that, I just want to say a huge thank you, echoing everyone else's thanks to, of course, JVP, but also Indian American Muslim Council and the wonderful Leila and Sam who took care of us this evening. Thank you. Leila, you want to close us out?
I'll just say thank you all so much. It is an honor to have this, to have you all, and to be able to hear the brilliance, the history, the analysis, and we so look forward to continuing the conversation. And with that, good night, everyone. Take care.
Good night.